Case number 3, multiple missing persons reported on Rio Grande National Forest, Colorado, United States. I didn't realize the Department of Investigations of Ojai, California had jurisdictions in Colorado. Anyways, missing persons in Rio Grande National Forest. This case presents 3 missing person cases. However, Detective Dorothea Padilla mentions that multiple people have gone missing in Rio Grande Forest for hundreds of years. Okay. That's a bit of an odd statement to include in the missing person case. Let's speed through this. First person, Andrew Mathers, went missing in 1999. Statement by Emily Hernandez as below. Andrew was my fiancé, and we like to do outside activities like hiking and camping. We had camped in many national parks. We wanted to do them all. Andrew wanted to camp in the Rio Grande forest. It was beautiful, of course. We brought our dog with us, Maggie. She was a beautiful lab. Andrew felt at home in the forest. He could find his way easily with the stars. I was not as good with directions. I relied heavily on Andrew. We arrived early in the morning and set off into the woods for about 5 or 6 miles before we set up camp. It was a lovely area. It was fall and the trees and grounds were littered with brown and yellow leaves. Maggie had barked happily as we set up camp. We had brought treats for her and kept throwing them into her mouth. Andrew had brought cans of food and a pot to cook in. We were extremely hungry once we finished our camp. The smell of the food wafted in the air. I remember throwing an anxious glance around the trees in case any wild animal came towards us. Andrew was never worried. He laughed at me as he served us plates of food. Maggie got a plate of her own and she devoured it. This memory is engraved in my mind. It is the only memory I want. The day sped by fast. I had packed a few books and laid down on a blanket as I read them until darkness fell. The 3 of us went inside the tent and huddled in our sleeping bags. I cuddled up with Maggie as Andrew spooned me from behind. I remember being torn awake by thunderous footsteps and what sounded like something very loud crashing through the tree branches. Maggie whimpered and I clutched her tightly as Andrew whispered that it would be okay. We did not have food inside our tent, and we just needed to be quiet. Whatever was outside sounded big. I was not sure what animal it could be. Bear, maybe? I shivered as Maggie pushed her face into my chest. Maggie seemed scared, and that freaked me out more than anything. The footsteps sounded closer until I could feel something outside our tent. The footsteps had stopped, but I knew it was outside. Maggie was shivering, or maybe it was me. It had gotten cold inside the tent. A chill so deep, I was not sure if it was nerves or if our surroundings had gotten colder. Andrew was silent behind me, but I could feel his breath on my neck. Several uncomfortable minutes passed, and all the while the immense quiet stretched on. Was it Khan? I did not believe so. Its presence seemed to leak into the tent, choking us all with fear and a smell. An awful, pungent smell reached my nose. I wanted to scream. After what felt like 30 minutes, a footstep right outside our tent started walking again. It was so close. I would not be surprised if its head had been peeking over the top of our tent. The footsteps were leading away from our camp until the presence vanished altogether. I was able to breathe again, fresh air that was not cold or smelly. Andrew squeezed my hand and said with what I could only assume was wonder, "What in the world was that?" I had never heard something so big. I did not like the sound of that. I told him so, but he brushed it off, saying I worried too much. I clutched Maggie tightly and went back to sleep as Andrew sat up. I suspected that he would have a hard time going back to sleep with the excitement, but I managed to fall asleep rather quickly. I awoke the next morning. Maggie was licking my face and I had to push her away. Andrew was not in the tent. I peeked outside. I could see that it was very early. The sun was barely rising. There were footsteps leading away from the tent, Andrew-sized footsteps. I shook my head, wondering why he left so early. Maggie barked, drawing me next to our tent where a large footprint sat. Maggie was growling at it. There were large footsteps leading in the same direction where Andrew's footsteps led. I clutched at my heart, fear settling inside me. I was sure Andrew would not have been dumb enough to follow the footsteps at night. And yet I ran, following the footsteps for a few feet until they disappeared altogether among the trees. "Andrew!" I had shouted, no longer cautious of drawing animals. "Andrew!" I shouted, again and again. Maggie barked beside me as if she too were calling for Andrew. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't go looking for Andrew. I would get lost, and I was horrible with directions. I thought it best to wait for him in our camp. I made food for Maggie and myself and pretended that everything was all right. I waited for Andrew. Waited until it was past noon. It had been about 6 hours since I had woken up, and I did not know what time Andrew left, but I knew he would not have left me for this long. I didn't even bother to pack up the tent. I took my bag, which was packed with water, snacks, and the car keys, and headed towards our car. It was a little over a 5-mile walk. I needed to go now, so it would still be early enough to call the park rangers and ask them to find Andrew. I found my way back to the car, though it took me longer than 5 miles, having lost myself for about 2. Still, when I turned on my car, it was 3:30. Maggie settled herself in the back seat, and I drove until I found the park ranger's office and told them that Andrew was missing. He needed to be looked for. They gave me uneasy looks, saying that every so often someone disappeared. I knew this. It was the same in all forests. It was the risk you took. But Andrew knew how to guide himself. He would not have strayed so far from me. And yet the horrible sounds from last night, the deep, pungent smell that followed the presence, flashed in my mind. Andrew would not have been so careless, would he? I cried myself to sleep that night as a search commenced for him. They searched for a week, and then they stopped. Gave up, I think. I still wonder why I didn't think it was odd that Andrew sat up right before I went to sleep. He would not have done that if he was trying to go back to sleep. I should have noticed that his voice was not scared but curious. I should have known that he would have wanted to catch a peek of whatever that was. End of statement. The park rangers only found the campsite that Emily left behind. However, there was no traces of a large set of footprints as Emily describes. The rangers classified the disappearance as one of many who steered off the trails and got lost. Second case of missing person Remy Black and Aaron Willard, who went missing in 2001. Statement by Brian Willard as follows. I had gone camping with my brother and his girlfriend. They were about 20 and I had just turned 14. I didn't want to go camping with them. I wanted to stay home that weekend and play video games. But my mom forced me to go since I needed fresh air and to socialize. I had brought my Game Boy and several spare batteries. I went, but I made sure that my brother and his girlfriend knew how much I did not want to be there. My brother would glare at me when his girlfriend Remy wasn't looking, but Remy was actually really sweet. She always made sure I was okay as we walked through the trail and offered me snacks and water every 5 minutes. I feel fucking terrible now, considering what happened. We set up camp close to the trail. It would be easy enough to find it and find your way back. All I did during the weekend was play my Game Boy and eat. The view was nice when I managed to tear my eyes away from the screen. Remy and Aaron would never stray too far and managed to rope me in on some of the hiking. I acted annoyed, but it wasn't so bad. Our last day there, Aaron had made us some food and Remy had strayed off a bit, but she was still close, maybe a few feet away. I couldn't see her, but I could hear her rummaging around. I went inside the tent and left the flap open as I laid on my stomach playing my Game Boy. Aaron was humming to himself, and I put the volume of my Game Boy high to try to drown out the noise. It worked. At least that's what I thought. My stomach was growling. I didn't know what was taking the food so long, so I went out of the tent to ask my brother if it was ready, but he wasn't outside. I headed towards the area I had seen him and called out to Remy. I couldn't hear her anymore either. I thought maybe Aaron and Remy had gone so they could make out or whatever. They hadn't been able to do that with me around. I picked up the food that Aaron was doing and finished it, annoyed that I had to do it myself. I went back to the tent when I was gone and continued playing. It had gotten dark. The last wisp of the sun disappearing. The only light now came from my Game Boy. I heard tussling a ways away coming towards the trees. I peeked through the open flaps of the tent but couldn't see anything. I needed a flashlight. I rummaged in the tent and found it, flashing it towards the space I heard something in, and there was something. An animal, maybe? But no, it looked like it was standing. It was big, very, very big, giant. Human? No, bear, maybe. It didn't sound like a bear. I saw its back, and it was tall, smooth. Not hairy, but much taller than a man. I only saw its back. I had to point my flashlight higher to see its head, but I couldn't do that. I couldn't do anything. I froze. I couldn't even shake. It was a paralyzing fear, and no matter how much I told my body to move, it wouldn't. All the while, I kept the flashlight pointing at its back. Smooth back. A gray, pale color. It was turning around, and I could hear its breathing get heavier. And then I was staring at its chest. It took a step forward, and I was finally able to move. I threw myself inside the tent and zipped it closed. I knew the flimsy tent would not protect me, but it was the only thing I could think of. The flashlight was still on, and I grabbed it to turn it off. The thing was outside, a horrible shadow in my tent, in the shape of a large human before I got the light to turn off. Its breath raggedy outside. The fear I felt inside me made me go ice cold. I could smell something rotten, and I could feel it outside. It was next to me, next to the tent, and I kept waiting for the moment it would tear it open. Its heavy breathing was the only thing I could hear. Or maybe it was my breathing. I just don't know anymore. And then a scream tore through the night. A terrible, drown-out scream filled with fear and pain. Remy. It was her scream. And I heard that thing, whatever it was, run. Loud, galloping footsteps ran towards her, and she kept screaming. I heard a loud tear, and the scream grew louder, more pain than fear now. Another loud tear, and a growl. Remy's scream gurgled, and then it died away. I could hear something outside gnawing and biting. It was eating Remy, and I stood in the tent doing nothing. I shook. Never once did I stop shaking as that thing kept eating and eating. Finally, the sound stopped. I heard the footsteps come back towards the tent. Felt the cold overtake me. My nose wrinkled as that horrible, rotten stench came back, and I waited for death to come. Waited as I heard that ragged breath outside. I closed my eyes, determined not to see it as it came for me. But it never came in. That whole night I felt it beside me, felt it not leave the camp. The smell and the cold assaulted me as I damn near almost died of fright. When the early rays of the sunlight came through the tent, I felt it finally leave. It took me a while to get out of the tent. I thought I was going to see blood or pieces of Remy's body, but nothing. Everything was as the night before. I ran straight towards where the trail was and found my way back. I passed early hikers and damn near clung to them, crying, not making any sense. They took me to the rangers, and they looked for Remy and my brother. They didn't really buy my story of the huge person, said there was nothing in the camp that showed signs of a struggle. They looked for them for about a week and then put them on the list of missing hikers. I told them that Remy and Aaron weren't walking away from the campsite. They were careful to not leave me alone. They didn't listen. I left my Game Boy there in the tent. Never even thought to grab it. Rangers gave it to me along with the packed-up campsite. I chucked it. I never wanted to look at a Game Boy again. I was a brat. Remy and Aaron were trying to make me have a good time, and I ignored them. Paid much more attention to my game and didn't even see that they needed help. I messed up, and now they're gone forever. End of statement by Brian Willard. I'm trying to find out why Detective Padilla had these case files. There does not seem to be any abduction unless she's granting some validity to Brian Willer's statement and believes that this, giant person is involved. Does not seem like it should have anything to do with the police department, but I will see if this next statement makes things clear. Statement by Norbert Tenios, as below. A couple of my friends and I went hiking in the forest. We went in the evening. We weren't going to be there too long. We did the 5-mile hike. It was going to take us about 2 hours, and we would be back not long after the sunset. We preferred to hike in the evening. Not so hot, and we were all shit waking up early. The 3 of us set off, Lidmy, Nathan, and I. We had our flashlights for when the sun started setting, and we each carried a water bottle. I had a firearm with me just in case. I would never use it unless it was absolutely necessary, and there was no other alternative. I knew the other guys had one on them as well. It made them feel braver than they actually were. We would usually bring some weed so we could smoke a bit while watching the sunset. That's probably the most peace each of us felt. Lidmy and Nathan were my best friends. They were both loud-mouthed and funny. I was quiet, and they somehow roped me into their group. It had been 10 years since that day. Lidmy and Nathan talked about some women they were dating. Both had a track record for dating lots of women. They had asked me if I was seeing someone, and I told them I wasn't anymore. I had just ended it with my girl. They changed the conversation, and all we were talking about was dumb shit about cartoons and some music. We stopped in a clearing the trail had led us to. It had a great view, and we brought out the weed and passed it around so we could each smoke a bowl. The smell wafted in the air as we all puffed along. I remember thinking I was glad to have come, that nothing could compare to this view. How wrong I was. The sun had nearly set as we were walking back. We had taken out our flashlights. Lidmy and Nathan kept flashing it in each other's eyes as they laughed at how stupid they were being. I kept my flashlight pointing straight when Lidmy yelped. He had been pointing his flashlight in odd directions and pointed them towards the trees beside the trail. Nathan and I turned around sharply as Lidmy pointed towards the trees with his flashlight. I could see his hand was shaking. There was something there, he had said. It was odd. It looked like, a person. Maybe a deer. Lidmy looked frightened, and we had teased him pretty badly about it until he got annoyed. He kept pointing the flashlight at the trees as we walked, paranoid as hell. Lidmy jumped again, shaking his flashlight badly from fear. I turned towards the spot he was looking at, but saw nothing. I wrapped my arms around myself. It had gotten cold, and I had a suspicion that one of these two had farted because a sinister smell clung in the air. I was banking on it being Lidmy. He was practically shitting his pants. I thumbed his back and told him to stop being a wimp. He looked apologetic, but still scared. We turned around and Nathan was gone. Lidmy and I looked around frantically, calling for Nathan. I stepped off the trail and looked behind the trees, telling Nathan to stop messing around. Lidmy stayed on the trail, calling for Nathan in a scared voice. He had taken out his gun. I thought it was smart and did the same. I went further, cursing at Nathan for choosing to play a prank now. I heard a gunshot from the trail behind me and ran back to Lidmy. I took the safety off my gun and almost reached the trail when it was Lidmy. He was on the floor, and there was something on top of him, and his gun was beside him. Lidmy, his mouth was open in horror, his eyes looking at the beast, and the beast had its fangs on his neck and pulled out half of his throat, and I knew he was dead. I raised my gun high and shot at it, but my hand was shaking and I'm not sure if I hit it, but it got off Lidmy and ran towards the other side of the trail, disappearing behind the trees. And it wasn't human. I don't know what it was. It was big, human-shaped. No fur, gray, skinny limbs, emaciated. It was so tall. It ran away on 2 legs, but its head had horns, like deer horns. But its head wasn't a deer. And that smell was back. His body smelled rotten. I looked down at Lidmi and he was drenched in his own blood, his mouth open in a silent scream. I hated to think that the last thing he saw was that thing, his eyes blank and open. I pointed my flashlight towards where the beast disappeared, and I saw his gray, emaciated chest peeking out between the trees, and I ran, faster than I'd ever done before, leaving that thing behind. A low growl building up shattered the silence of the forest, and I knew I was a goner, knew it was that thing. I kept running, hearing that growl all around me, not knowing if he was right behind me or if that sound carried and he was actually far away. I didn't smell that rotten smell, and that brought me a small comfort. I made it out of the trail and found myself in the deserted parking lot. The car was there, but I was not the one with the keys. I broke the window and climbed in. Thank God I knew how to hotwire a car, and I was gone. My friends, I had left them behind. I knew Lidmi was dead, but not Nathan. I was not sure. I didn't see him, but I don't see how he would have disappeared otherwise. I told people, of course, but they said it had to be some other wild animal, that it was dark, and I didn't get a good enough glimpse, that my fear made my brain see irrational things. They didn't find Lidmi's body in the trail, nor any blood, though I knew there was a lot of it. No Nathan either. Only I got out alive, and now I'm just here, alone, without my two best friends, and I have no more love of hiking. End of statement. The park rangers did not find any trace of Nathan and Lidmi's body, nor their belongings, though Lidmi's gun was found several months later 30 miles from the trail Norbert says they were in. There was no prints on the gun except Lidmi's, and all the bullets except for one were still inside the barrel. I see that Detective Padilla listed the words cold and smell as meaningful, and though I still do not agree that this case should be in police jurisdiction, I do admit that that description each of these cases provide of the possible culprit is the same, though what thing could make the air around them cold is beyond me. It seems as if what each of the people involved were experiencing were the endorsements of fear, and that was what made them feel cold. Although the description is not of any real animal, it is possible that in the darkness they were not able to see the animal well. It is suspicious that they each saw a similar animal, yet as I said, that is not for the police to play guesswork. There's no real crime here, so I will list these cases as closed and put them under the resolved cases file. End of case 3.
Forgotten Creatures, a weekly horror podcast by Dark Nymph Productions, available on all podcast providers. For more information, follow us on Instagram at Forgotten Creatures Podcast.